anything happened to my girl, it just wasn't even comprehensible. I wanted to argue that I wouldn't be like her, that it wasn't the same, that I'd know that I'd only be hurting myself, but I had no way of knowing how true that'd be. If I could be certain that the people I loved could be happy without me? Maybe. I didn't know, and I prayed to any fucking deity that was listening that I'd never have to find out. The most astonishing part of it all wasn't the fact she refused my help, because that was something I'd grown accustomed to over the months. It was how strikingly familiar the whole situation seemed to me. It took me an inexcusable amount of time to realize why. I'd never fully understood Carlisle until I'd had to watch my mother turn away my every attempt at heartfelt persistence. There was no fucking misery worse than watching someone you love suffer while refusing your help. I felt a deep sense of dread as I gazed at her form on the sofa, knowing that I had done this to Carlisle. Of course, my situation paled in comparison to hers, but I really didn't think severity mattered much. And then I just fucking got it. For the first time ever, I really got Carlisle. I really understood his desperation to see me progress and grow past the pain of losing it all, and I truly felt like I knew him, like I knew the depth of his soul. It was so much more pure and respectable because I was a complete stranger to him, and as this was my flesh and blood sitting before me, it never occurred to me that he never considered me as anything less. Without another word, I turned and left her there, traveling to the only place in the city that offered me any comfort at all. I lit a cigarette as I stepped inside the phone booth, cradling the black receiver between my ear and my shoulder as I fished the roll of quarters from my pocket and began inserting them. I entered his number with haste, feeling the tension of reality leave me as I listened to the reverberating ring. First, the familiar click of the connection with the other side of the fence, and then Carlisle's soft and expectant, "Hello." I sighed away from the microphone and situated myself on the ledge, straining my ears to hear the background noises as I often did. I never heard anything other than the occasional flutter of papers, but even the static sound of his study's silence felt recognizable.
"I was beginning to think you wouldn't call,"
he began. He sounded different. Detached. I was late, and I had to battle the urge to apologize for my tardiness, as my teeth ground together in restraint. Another long pause of silence until he continued,
"It's raining here."
"Is it ever not?
"I saw on the news that today was cool where you are. I can't recall if you ever had a preference."
He paused again, his sigh creating a hiss, and he couldn't recall it, because I'd never told him my preference.
"Emmett called this morning after his classes, and he seems happy. I think his coach might."
My brows furrowed in confusion over his abrupt silence. I could hear his breathing coming through the receiver, but he just stopped talking. I began tapping my toe against the ground in impatience as the pause drew on. My eyes shifted around the sidewalk outside, watching the traffic, without really seeing it.
"Edward, I can't,"
he finally continued in a whisper before trailing off into another silence. My hands balled into fists in frustration, until he finished in a weary voice.
"I can't do this anymore. If you want to talk to me, then talk to me. If you need help, then I'll gladly offer it. But I can't keep talking to nothing."
He waited exactly 5 seconds before sighing and hanging up with a click that broke the connection to the other side of the fence. He couldn't keep talking to nothing, and I couldn't offer him anything, if I couldn't offer him everything. I knew this now. Before my mother, it would have seemed like a really dickhead thing for him to do, but I talked to nothing every day. When I returned to the townhouse, the living room was empty, my sketchbook abandoned on the sofa. I wandered to the bedroom down the hall, and the door was slightly ajar. I nudged it open with my hand, my eyes immediately falling upon my mother's form sitting at the edge of her bed. The lights were on, and she had a bottle in her hand when she met my gaze. I supposed she had bought two after all. She stared at me numbly as I stood in the doorway for many moments, until her lips curled up into an empty grin.
"You understand now, don't you?"
she asked softly. I briefly darted my eyes to the bottle in her hand, before once again meeting her gaze. "I can't help you," I admitted with total defeat, even though my determination protested loudly in the thrumming of my veins. As sure as I now knew Carlisle's misery, I knew the other side of the coin just as well, if not better. There was no helping someone who didn't want someone. who didn't feel like it was even possible or deserved. It turned me into the detached man on the other end of the phone, waiting for someone to finally reach out and speak, all the while knowing they never would. It turned her into the bitter recluse who was forced to hide inside her bedroom, constantly annoyed and resentful of the one who'd never stopped trying. Most importantly, she'd become even angrier at herself for not being enough to change for me. I knew, because I had been that person once before. Her smile remained, as she shook her head sadly, her glassy eyes drifting to my hand.
But I bet you can help someone else,
she whispered, and I followed her gaze to Bella's bronze ring as I thumbed it gently. Her smile had fallen when I met her gaze once again, and I watched her throat bob with a swallow. She stood, setting the bottle on the floor by her feet, before walking to me. She searched my eyes for a moment as she stood before me, and then she smiled once again, though the tears in her eyes betrayed her.
You tell your Bella she'd better be good to you,
she choked, her eyes shining as I engulfed her in my arms and crushed her to my chest because I couldn't stay if I couldn't help her. We both knew it. I buried my face into her shoulder to stifle the sobs that shook us both, hers and mine.
Always brush your teeth 3 times a day?
She sobbed into my chest, and I nodded. We cried in unison as we embraced, and I allowed her one last moment to be the mother she had wanted to be but couldn't.
Always say, please, and thank you, and hold the door open for strangers,
she gasped, as we shook against one another, and I kept nodding, as she sounded off just about every good manner she had ever taught me in 2 thick mumbles against my chest. My sobs had subsided into soundless tears by the time she had concluded her motherly orders, and I chose that exact second to begin following them. Thank you, I whispered into her hair, and reluctantly released her while wiping my eyes. When our watery gazes met, it was abundantly clear what I was thanking her for. I was thanking her for Carlisle and Bella and Jasper and Emmett, and even though it took me 10 years to see it for what it was, I was thanking her for the gift of her sacrifice. Because even though she was wrong in so many ways, and it wasn't always perfect, it had led me to those people, and that side of the fence. She could have kept me with her and I would have been happy never knowing anything different, but she wanted more for me than this. Her vision of my having complete perfection was oddly selfish in her insistence to put distance between me and any of my remaining family, but it didn't make it any less of a sacrifice. I could see that now. I could respect it. I could forgive it. I could never again take it for granted. Her tear-filled eyes gazed back into mine gratefully, and we finished our impromptu goodbye with one last embrace, and strained reminders that we still loved one another. She was still my mother, and I was still her son. I turned to leave her in the doorway of her bedroom, and her phantom smile followed me. I gathered my necessities into my arms. I left the sketchbook lying on the sofa so that she'd still smile when she saw my girl. I knew she'd imagine how happy she was making me. I ran to the Volvo and shoved it all inside while trying to ignore the searing pain that engulfed my chest upon leaving my mother of my own accord. I drove away from the curve of her townhouse. I drove past the corner store she bought her liquor from and the dirty phone booth that had been my connection to the other side of the fence. I passed the takeout restaurant that had fed us for the past 3 months, where I'd first realized that I was a Cullen. I passed the city cemetery's southern hill, where my father lay, where I finally realized that being a Cullen didn't make me any less of amazing. I drove out of hell and I didn't look back. My mother wanted me to have heaven, and heaven was in Forks, Washington.